So, as you know, we're between you and the next session, which is about the future of love. And I thought we'd make this session about the future of hate speech. But then it was announced yesterday that Facebook also wants to have a fair share in romance and the future of love, because they're going to start a new dating platform or dating tool. So I was just wondering whether you think that in the midst of the biggest data privacy scandal Facebook has had to face so far, this is a very good idea to get into even more privacy.
Would you like to take that?
So I'll answer it in two parts. A, it's hilarious, right? You know, we're so concerned about privacy, we're taking it seriously, you can delete your history. And also, we really want to get into dating and figure out your love life. And we'll be awesome at it because we know everything about you. Sort of the incongruity was startling. And also, props to whoever in this building gave the quote that now that Facebook has a new dating app, we think US-Russia relations will improve. I'm not sure who it was, but somebody upstairs. But on the other hand, I'm not actually against it, right? There's a whole group of people who feel like Facebook's having a really hard time. All they need to do is fix Facebook. Zuckerberg should be heads down, fixing their darn thing. And my view is that Facebook has a ton of problems, and it's getting about the right amount of criticism. But the criticism it's getting over privacy is way overstated, and the criticism it's getting about other stuff is way understated. And also, the company should be allowed to build some new stuff, and this is a really good use of Facebook. So I thought there was an incongruity in the announcements, but I'm totally fine with it. Fred, you may disagree.
Well, I think that they just need to be a little bit more careful, and I think that tomorrow's papers are going to have a little bit more detail on the fact that part of the problem that Facebook faces is that it can't seem to control it. It's been taken to the woodshed, and it's in the woodshed for a long time now, and so it needs to really mind its P's and Q's, and it lives in a world where it doesn't really have control over that. And so, what I think a lot of us will see tomorrow is that, the day after Facebook announced that it was getting into the dating service, one of the people who works on the security team was just fired for stalking women, and using Facebook, his internal Facebook account, to actually stalk women. So I'm thinking that that's going to make them look bad. And I'm just thinking that if they're going to, they need to grow, and they need to get into new areas and lines of business, because otherwise they can't attract the best and the brightest people to kind of come work there. But they need to figure out a way to better control the ecosystem that they operate in, because that's just going to be a really bad look.
The title of the session is hashtag delete Facebook, and to get some audience engagement here, who actually deleted Facebook in this room? Huge sample group. Okay, some figure two hands up, three hands. Okay, who knows somebody apart from those three who deleted Facebook? Okay, a couple more hands. 15, I'd say. Who changed their privacy settings lately? Pretty much the same number, but in fact, the majority didn't do anything in this room. Is this sort of going with the quarterly figures that were just announced? I think year-on-year earnings rose by 49%. Do people just not care?
I think people
enough.
I think people care. A lot of the people, the number of people I know who have said they're done with Facebook in the past 6 months, I would say is a dozen. I mean, and this is just in casual conversation. So I mean, I think that there are people who are actually really getting fed up with it. But Facebook has its hooks into us in some pretty deep ways, and I think most of us would acknowledge that we all get some utility out of it. And so I sometimes think that delete Facebook sounds awesome, but I actually think that we just need to figure out a way to better control Facebook, because I don't know, the idea. I'd love to think. I mean, let's put it this way: if if everybody decided to delete Facebook and it went away, like in the space of 3 months, because its user base fell from like 2 billion to 0, that would be the best story to come down the pike in Silicon Valley in the many years that I've been working there. But I just don't think it's going to happen that way.
So on more practical terms, Nicholas, do you think Facebook should be regulated? And if so, how?
Yeah, Facebook should totally be regulated. And I think what's going to happen is that will happen and we'll screw up all the regulations. So Facebook should be regulated in certain ways, right? The Honest Ads Act, for example, Mark Warner's bill. Really good idea, right? There should be regulations about ads, tracking who buys your ads, and you should probably have some kind of equivalency between the rules for advertising on television and the rules for advertising on social media. That makes sense. Small, minimally invasive regulation, that's a good idea. There should probably be some US version privacy rules of GDPR, maybe not the whole million-page version with micro instructions on how to engineer your platform for privacy first, but good privacy protection legislation. What you should not do is you should not get rid of the Section 230 exemptions and make Facebook completely responsible for everything that everybody publishes on it, or all social media platforms for it. You should not pass regulations that inadvertently entrench Facebook's monopoly power, which is entirely possible. In fact, some privacy regulations, this is a really interesting implication of their dating app. One thing that's really bad for Tinder and other dating apps is that it's much harder to pull data from Facebook right now. So that means that Facebook's new version has a huge competitive advantage because of the privacy restrictions that are coming. So one thing that's happening is we're entrenching Facebook through changes and potentially also through regulations. Antitrust regulation, the strongest thing you could do. Maybe in a perfect world with a very intelligent government, you could have a sensible antitrust regime that somehow splits off Instagram or WhatsApp. If our government of the United States right now tries to do antitrust on Facebook, they will screw up a massively growing, job-creating, important part of Silicon Valley. So yes, Facebook should be regulated. Our government is probably not up to the task. So we'll see what happens in Europe. We'll see what happens at the state level. But the answer is both yes and no.
Do you think Europe is up to the task?
Maybe more up to the task than us, but it's also got like a different problem where it's so anti-Facebook, I feel, and there's so much heat and anger towards Facebook, you're going to get excessive regulation that is going to then either, possibly, regulation has a way of locking in incumbents often. You could possibly lock in Facebook, or you could have just, create massive inefficiencies in the way it works.
Fred, in terms of self-regulation, at the F8, we heard more detail on how the news feed should sort of be a little more hygienic, cleansed of hyperpartisan stuff, non-trustworthy stuff. What Mark Zuckerberg actually said, I think, was to create, or to make users be able to access trustworthy information, find a common ground, and less polarized stuff.
Can I take this one? Because
sure.
My view on Facebook is that all the stuff about privacy is kind of heat and excitement, and it's not really the problem, right? And most of when people talk about Facebook and their critiques of Facebook are not the problem. The problem is, in fact, newsfeed. It is this. Like, if Facebook wants to fix itself and become a more force for good, it needs to figure out how to fix newsfeed so it doesn't push polarization, so it doesn't incentivize people to stick things on there that make people outraged, so it kind of facilitates
but who's Facebook to decide what is trustworthy and what is a common ground?
Well, that's an algorithmic problem, right? So how do you determine what is trustworthy is something where it's going to depend partly on Facebook making choices, partly on us making choices, partly on the way algorithms sorts. I mean, Google does it.
And for instance, we're sort of pretty US or sort of Western European based, but in a country like Turkey, what is trustworthy in Turkey? And what is the common ground in a highly polarized society such as the Turkish one?
Right, so this is where you really want to rely not on the government's choices, right? This is where, should Facebook be regulated, has a very different answer for the United States and from Turkey. And in fact, making it, that's going to go down a rabbit hole. On the who determines what is trustworthiness, it's a whole mix of factors. But Facebook should absolutely be trying to determine them. And this is the hard problem, right? This is what Zuckerberg should be spending all his time on, not on the privacy stuff. I think like the clear history stuff is good. He should be spending all of his time on the complicated question of, okay, for trustworthiness, how much of it is based on historical use? How much of it is based on like the factors that Google puts in? When Google does its ranking, that's really based on trustworthiness. How much of it is based on surveys? How much of it is based on semantic analysis of comments and what people say underneath posts, right? If there's a publication and people always put the word Snopes or always put the word false, like, shouldn't you mark them down for that? Does the algorithm mark them down sufficiently for that? Like, that's a really hard problem, but that's the crucial problem. And if Facebook can be 20% better at giving us slightly more trustworthy information, that changes the whole news ecosystem here and in Turkey, where you'd also have to have a different set of factors. But that's the real problem.
Well, and one of the things I wanted to jump in here on is that, like, there's some simple things that Facebook could do here in Newsfeed to help us and help itself. So, like, if you look at Newsfeed, you'll realize, maybe not realize, that everything looks the same. One of the things that's, like, really amazing is that, you know, if you stand in front of a newsstand at an airport, or you look at people looking at websites in a newsroom or any other situation, just by looking from far away, you can tell what they're looking at, right? I mean, like, Wired looks a certain way, the New York Times looks a certain way, Build looks a certain way, TMZ looks a certain way. Media brands, like, have spent zillions of dollars not only on the content that they produce, but also on the look and feel of the publication. It's why, like, you can stand in front of a newsstand at an airport and, without looking at any headlines, know where the car ads are and know where the travel magazines are. And so what Facebook has done is it has stripped out all those visual identifiers in Newsfeed, and I know why they did it, but I think that Zuckerberg believed that all of us were smart enough to tell the difference between real news and fake news without those visual identifiers. But I think the evidence is in that, like, even the smartest among us can't. So, like, if Facebook all of a sudden stuck some of those visual cues back into Newsfeed, we wouldn't solve all the problems that we're talking about here, but we'd solve some of them, because then you wouldn't wind up with, like, you know, the little story, the crazy fake story over here in the Denver Guardian being right up against, like, the real story in the New York Times. And, like, you know, even just labeling things, for example, like, this is an opinion piece versus this is a news piece. Facebook doesn't do any of that. And some of those labels, I think, would help us as we go forward.
So my personal concern is, as you mentioned, it's an algorithmic problem, that the algorithm, if changed, may become even more patronizing than it already is. So let me take a food analogy. There are some things we want to eat, hamburgers in my case, and there is other stuff we should eat, like broccoli. As journalists, we know there is other stuff people want to read and want to know and want to share, which isn't necessarily the stuff we all think they should know and should read and should watch. So in figurative terms, is Mark Zuckerberg going to force us to eat more broccoli?
That would be a really bad thing, because I really don't like broccoli or Brussels sprouts, just for the record.
It's so good for you and so relevant.
Well, I mean, the question, though, is he making us, are the changes that I'm suggesting moving us from hamburgers to broccoli, or are they moving us from poison to hamburgers, right? And so I do think that there is a certain amount of paternalism that is probably okay in the way you structure your newsfeed album, just as there is in newspapers, right? You put the stories that are most important on the front page, you put stories that are more scintillating inside, you do feel like there's some kind of a public obligation. But you're right that I don't want it to be just, 8 people at Facebook say, okay, the New York Times is trustworthy, Wired is trustworthy, this publication is not trustworthy, this story is good. I do want it to have some of the virtues, some of the wisdom of the crowd, some of the chaos that you have in the Facebook feed. I just think it needs to be, the algorithm needs to work differently. And I actually think the changes that they've announced, right? So the point of our story, we put this bloody Zuckerberg on the cover, but it's a bloody Zuckerberg with a slight smile. And in fact, I was meeting with a tech executive yesterday who really doesn't like Mark Zuckerberg. And he's like, why the fuck did you put a smiley Mark Zuckerberg on the cover? I was like, dude, he's bloody. Like, what is your problem?
Did you discuss that for long, the cover? Or was that, because as I got it.
At Wired?
Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. Like, was it, it's really complicated if you're going to put a bloody Mark Zuckerberg on the cover, right? Because you don't want to, it was an image that I felt captured the essence of the story that I thought people would get. There's no words on the cover. but you don't want to be glamorizing violence, right? You certainly don't want to be inciting somebody to violence. You don't want to be gross. You also want to convey the message of the story. And the message of the story was, this is a company and a person who's had tons of troubles, but who's actually making some positive changes, right? I felt like the meaningful interactions, algorithmic changes that were announced in December, I think the trustworthy stuff, though it's not working yet, will be helpful. I did feel like the company was coming around to realizing how it could be weaponized, and that was sort of the point of the story. So we wanted to convey, this is the guy in a tough, he's the 6th round of a fight, but he thinks he's going to win or he's going to come out okay. Or this is Bruce Willis at the end of Die Hard, right? That was the image we were going for. And so we had a lot of images that some just looked awful. Some he looked like really mean. So we spent a lot of time with the mouth. We spent a lot of time with the shading of the cover, and that's what we came up with. But clearly, as I learned yesterday, there's some people who feel like we just put like smiling Zuck on the cover, which is news to me.
So the piece is basically inside Facebook, and I'm sure everybody here has read it, Mark Zuckerberg's last 2 years of hell. Are there any plans to serialize that? So given that this piece was published on 12th of February, which was before Cambridge Analytica became really, really big, and before 10 hours of congressional testimony, will we read the 3 years of Mark Zuckerberg's hell, 4 years, 10 years? Will it ever stop? Do you think he'll manage?
I think that this is a question for Nick Thompson, don't you think?
Well, I mean, we did a month later, we wrote, that was we did like inside the 4 days that shook Facebook. So Fred and I called all our Facebook sources again and asked them to explain the Cambridge Analytica stuff. During the congressional hearings, we called all our Facebook sources and asked them, what they thought watching the congressional hearings, which was pretty funny. Basically, all of them said, we were terrified, how is Mark going to do? He's not that good on a stage, what if he says something stupid? They're all going to be out to get him, he's walking into the lion's den. And then they all said that about 15 minutes in, once they realized how ill-prepared the senators were and how bad the questions were, they were like, he's going to be fine. And they started making jokes and drinking beers.
What did you make of the congressional hearings?
I more or less agreed with the Facebook people's interpretation. I thought Zuckerberg, there were a couple of things that I thought were super interesting. So top line, he came off, I think, pretty well. Answered the questions well, didn't make any insane mistakes. 2, I was super interested by how little he knew about the ad product, and particularly how offline tracking works, which apparently he realized too after the hearings and has been studying it relentlessly since the hearings, and that's why some of the changes at F8 are being announced. So I was super interested in that. And then there were some really interesting questions. The Lindsey Graham questions about antitrust were, quite interesting. The Durbin questions about privacy. Actually, there were a few moments where we broke into real debates, but there was also just an awful lot of silliness and how does my Wi-Fi work? So that's what I thought of that.
My son's on Instagram.
One of the things I wanted to add about the hearings, though, is that they reminded me a little bit about the Microsoft hearings in front of the Judiciary Committee 20 years ago. So the meetings 20 years ago, the Judiciary Committee, which Orrin Hatch ran in the late 90s, invited Bill Gates and Scott McNealy and Jim Barksdale and a handful of people from Silicon Valley to come and testify about the Microsoft monopoly. And that was the hearing in which Bill Gates said to the world that he didn't think Microsoft was a monopoly, and that the scariest thing that kept him up at night was the entrepreneur in the garage that was coming up with something that was going to defeat Microsoft, which at the time seemed profoundly silly. And what a lot of people have said since then about that hearing is that while there was no regulation that actually came out of that specific hearing, it gave the Justice Department, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, air cover, political permission to go after Microsoft, that the antitrust suit would not have happened but for that hearing. And so what's going to be interesting about the hearing, about the Zuckerberg hearing, is the degree to which it gives other federal agencies, whether or not that's the FTC or state AGs or the, dare I say, the antitrust division of the current Justice Department. I probably shouldn't say that. permission to kind of go after Facebook and hold them to more account. So I think we should watch this space.
Do you think Mark Zuckerberg's testimony was sincere, or was it just very well rehearsed?
Yes. I mean, I think that like he really. I think that a lot of what Zuckerberg. I think a lot of what Zuckerberg says, I actually think he believes, and I think that like a lot of Facebook's problems are that Zuckerberg has been a little naive about the power that his platform has and not paid close enough attention to sort of the impact that he has been having. But, you know, I think that, you know, he really needs to be sincere in the efforts that he has going forward, because he's out of political capital. I mean, I think that like Facebook really at this point, if it screws up it doesn't have like a Cambridge Analytica type screw up left that it can figure out a way to explain away. So he needs to really make it happen. I mean, like Facebook actually needs to start, you know, Zuckerberg built Facebook by asking forgiveness rather than permission, because none of us would have actually joined Facebook voluntarily when he started it. But it's a big enough and important enough company that like they now actually need to ask permission for almost everything they do, and that's going to be a big change for them.
I think if Mark Zuckerberg were here and you gave him truth serum and asked him about the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Can we do that? Can we do that? That would be awesome.
We'll see if we can Skype him in. I think that he would say he is genuinely sorry for the pain he caused his company and that he should have anticipated this. And I think he would say he's genuinely sorry for the communications disaster and that he does know that Facebook's success depends on people trusting it and he should have anticipated it. And I think he would also say, this is fucking nuts and fucking annoying because we closed that loophole. This asshole gave this stuff to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica stuff didn't fucking work. The Trump campaign barely used it, had no effect on the election. So it's stuff that was kind of taken not because of our fault, used in a way that wasn't our fault, laundered in a way, and it wasn't even effective, and you guys are making it like screaming about this. That's bullshit. That is what I think he would say if he were here and given truth serum. He can't say that. That wouldn't have gone over well at the congressional hearing. That's just a guess, but I think it's probably what he would say.
Actually, like one of the things that like I think he has to worry about is that one of the things Zuck has to worry about now is that Facebook has become a political football. You know, Silicon Valley like has successfully, until recently, Silicon Valley really successfully managed to avoid a lot of the crazy politics of Washington. And you know, Facebook, by getting sucked into like the heat of the Washington election spin cycle, is now like being watched carefully by both parties for any sign that they might be doing something to help the other side win. And so one of the things I sometimes worry about Facebook going forward is that like they might be able to do everything right in the 2018 election, but if, for example, the Republicans lose the House and the Senate, or lose one of those, to what degree will Fox News then and Breitbart and the Republican spin machine use that as a way just to create a narrative that basically says that Facebook created this problem and that those elections are illegitimate? And I think that's going to be a problem not just for our democracy, but not just for Facebook, for our democracy. And it's like, and I think Facebook is going to have a hard time managing that. And it's out of its control.
Zuckerberg just said that he needed about 3 years to fix Facebook and was 1 year in, so another 2 years to fix it. Will he have that much time?
You mean, will he still be CEO for the next 3 years? Or will...
I guess there's no way
I mean,
that
there are a couple things that could go wrong, right? So the board could remove him as CEO. No way.
It could that would be astonishing.
It could drop, as Fred said, you know, like you could just have it, network effects work on the way down as they work on the way up. You can imagine people start leaving. It makes it easier for the next person to leave. You can imagine them collapsing. That's not going to happen, right? We've seen that in the data. We've seen the earnings. He's going to be okay.
from a sort of European perspective, it's quite interesting to see that the narrative of Google has sort of changed, and that when you talk to people at Google, they basically say, we're a search engine, don't call us a platform, we're basically a search engine. And they seem to be forgetting that there is something like YouTube. So I wonder, because Mark Zuckerberg makes for such a good target and a good cover boy, are we sort of letting Google, YouTube, Twitter off the hook?
It's a super interesting question, because you can argue it both ways. You can say that basically Zuckerberg is taking all the incoming fire and like all of the sort of pent-up outrage over privacy. It's all just coming at him, and it lets YouTube and everybody else off the hook, right? And Susan Wojcicki's fine, and Jack Dorsey's fine, and they're staying away. Or you can argue that the attacks on Zuckerberg are cracking the dam, and that what's going to come next, journalists are going to dig into YouTube, and they're going to, as some are, like Charlie Warzel at BuzzFeed, like people are going to dig in, find the stuff that people found on Facebook, and they're going to be whistleblowers, and then it's going to get just as bad. My guess is that it's closer to the former, that Zuckerberg is taking a lot of the heat, and that it's probably helpful in some ways. I mean, it is changing the narrative in a way that's harmful for all of Silicon Valley, but I think in general it's probably the former, not the latter.
So, again, audience engagement. Are there any questions to our guests from Wired? Or you might just think about whether, yeah. Okay, could we have a mic? Mic is coming, hold on. Just wait for a second so everybody can hear you. Yeah, no, it's fine. So a comment, not a question.
Before I joined Facebook, I made some observations, and one of those was the clamor for membership and how they got finally funded. A lot of those members that kept rising as it was discussed, as it was presented on the movie Social Media.
Social network, yeah.
Social network, and they showed the membership rising and rising and rising. A lot of those membership were fake. First of all, that's my first observation. They came from the Eastern Europe, they came from India, they came from South Asia. But a lot of those members it's almost like an automated membership system. Second observation. When I joined Facebook and I was looking for different types of open source scripts, there's one script that says Facebook clone, meaning you can just do an exact Facebook replica of Facebook, but with no membership. But you can launch it, you can install it, you can launch it. So right now, I can't wrap my head around why this thing, which is supposed to connect us, became such a valued stock. How did the venture capitalists who supported Facebook? Because it's meant to just connect people.
Let me just cut in there.
Yeah.
So, especially the fake accounts.
How did they miss it?
How are they going to tackle that? Is that still such a problem?
Well, actually, like one of the things I was going to, thank you for the question. One of the things I was actually going to mention is, if you really want to like drill into Facebook's problem, it boils down to fake accounts. I mean, there are lots and lots of other problems, but like right now, like the biggest problem Facebook has is that people figured out a way to like come up with fake accounts and then like use those fake accounts to do all kinds of nefarious things. And if Facebook can actually get that under control, and it certainly says that it's hiring a zillion people to do that, I think that actually will go a long way to sort of solving a lot of the issues that we have. To that end, like I don't know whether or not the solution there is regulation as much as like transparency on Facebook's part and a change in the way that we think of what we think a small number is. So, for example, like right now, Facebook says that it has like 2 or 3% fake accounts, which sounds like a small number, but like actually when you add it up is an enormous number. It's like, I don't know, 40 million fake accounts. And so maybe perhaps like the way we sort of measure and hold Facebook account is sort of, should be the same way that they hold themselves to account on things like server uptime, for example. Like, so Facebook, I'm sure, although they don't probably publicly talk about this, I'm sure Facebook internally does not talk about their server uptime as 99%, because it turns out that like, even though 1% server downtime sounds like a small number, it's actually 15 days, no, it's 3 days, 15 hours. So I'm sure they actually figure that out. I'm sure they actually measure that out to like, not only like 99.9 or 99.99, but 99.9999. And so like, our definition of like what a tolerable, what a small number of fake accounts should be, should maybe change. Like, so if we held Facebook to like, you know, 0.00001 fake accounts, like that would be an interesting conversation.
Here's one question from Pia.
Thank you. I was wondering, as Facebook is such a unique company and Mark Zuckerberg is in a very special situation, what will be learnings and takeaways and do's and don'ts that future social networks will remember from these past 2 years of Facebook?
I think that the thing that social networks need to learn, and I don't know whether they will learn, is that among them, you know, Facebook had core problems with its algorithm that it didn't notice, but what it really didn't do that everybody should do is scenario plan. They didn't think through, how could our platform be weaponized? What is the worst case scenario? And I think that's something that, in general, the culture of move fast and break things doesn't think about. Is building the next thing. You're not thinking about, okay, how is this thing that I built, how could this be used in the wrong way? And I think that I hope that that is one of the lessons, that somebody who builds a very important platform will think through worst case scenarios, bad scenarios, what could happen to politics, and by even going through that process, we'll be able to prevent a lot of the worst stuff from happening.
Okay, we have one last question here, because we're running out of time, and in between I'm going to ask one. As editor, which you are, if you could make 3 wishes for the news industry, what should Facebook do for the news industry? Is it share user data with the publishers? Is it help subscription scale? What would you, as editor-in-chief of Wired, wish Facebook could do for you?
Well, they have recently made it integrated subscriptions into Facebook Instant. And they recently made an important shift of basically making it possible for publications to use it. They had previously set the level so high it was useless. I think that if they really wanted to, they could help massively with subscription acquisition by looking in the data set of who reads, who subscribes, what are the patterns, and help the publishers identify people. At The New Yorker, where I worked prior to Wired, our best method for acquiring subscriptions was through Facebook ads. And so if you were to build that into the algorithm, you could be extremely helpful for publications. I do think the core changes in the newsfeed that prioritize depth, not sensationalism, would have a huge trickle-down effect on the journalism industry. So those are 2 things I want, and the thing I don't want is the thing that all my colleagues want, which is direct payments from Facebook. I think that would just create crazy conflicts of interest, and it skeezes me out.
Last question.
On a similar topic, how much of your traffic is driven by, at Wired, is driven by Facebook and other social media platforms? And how does that affect how you assign and promote stories?
So it's probably about 30% is coming from Facebook. So Facebook, if the traffic patterns are super interesting for us and for the publishing industry, where basically Google, the share that Facebook has and the share that Google has. So Google, let's see if I can do this with the microphone here. Forget it, I can't show it. But basically Google is much higher, Facebook comes up, Facebook surpasses Google, and then Facebook drops, right? And so Facebook is dropping for everybody and Google is climbing. And that's due to Google's focus on AMP, Google's integration with all kinds of new products where they recommend stories, and then Facebook's sort of deprioritization of news that has been going on for the last 6 months and has been pushed heavily since January. So Facebook's share is declining rapidly. To the question of how do we promote stories, there's just a whole art to finding the language that you think will work with your audience. With Google, it's finding the right keywords that you think will resonate with in SEO, and there are hundreds of factors like how you load page latency and all that stuff. The super hard question, though, and the most complicated question is, how do you deal with writing a story that's critical of a company that controls your business model, right? And so Facebook's algorithm controls a large part of whether we'll get readers. And there's a risk. And I think it clearly crossed my mind that something bad could happen, that Facebook could retaliate. And I think just as an editor, you have to just say, well, that's life. You just have to write the fairest story you possibly can. You put it out in the world, you promote it as hard as you can, and you see what happens. But it is a complicated world we live in, where the companies we cover are also the companies that have huge influences on our economic models. And that's, you just have to make the right ethical publishing choices, is what I believe.
And I think you even did a 60-minute Facebook Live on that Facebook story, which is still out there, so anybody wanting to watch that, highly recommendable. So, Future of Love coming up. Thank you so much for sharing a lot on the future of Facebook, of social media with us. Thank you very much for sharing time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your great questions, and thank you everybody for having us here.